Good afternoon. I am Evan Endress with Citizens for Pennsylvania's Future. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Energy Benchmarking, Lessons for Medium and Small Pennsylvania Jurisdictions. Get things started here. As I said, I'm Evan Endress. I'm a project coordinator specifically with Penn Future's Energy Center. For those of you who aren't familiar with Penn Future, we are a statewide nonprofit environmental and clean energy advocacy group. We are foundation and member supported. We are a 501c3. Lately, we've been doing a lot of work with municipal sustainability issues. Our Penn Save energy contracting initiative. We've done a lot of work on solar and zoning and permitting recommendations for municipalities. So we've developed a list of municipalities that we have good relationships with. Out of conversations with them came a lot of inquiry about what is this energy benchmarking that they've been hearing about, especially since Philadelphia is the first city in Pennsylvania to take the lead on executing such an initiative. So that's really where this webinar came from. And once again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. So we have several panelists on the line here that are going to offer their perspective on energy benchmarking and some lessons that can help municipal officials and organizations that might be on the webinar today to educate each other and start thinking about how this could work for your municipality in the long term. So first we're going to hear from Caroline Keicher. She's a program manager with program manager for Building Energy Performance Policy at the Institute for Market Transformation. They're a national organization that does a lot of work on supporting organizations and jurisdictions that are executing benchmarking. Then we're going to hear from Alex Dews from the City of Philadelphia. He's the Policy and Program Manager for the Mayor's Office of Sustainability at the City of Philadelphia. And they have instituted a benchmarking policy, and Alex is in the front lines of helping his city execute that. And he'll offer his insights to the group. Then we'll hear from Holly Shields, who's the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator for the Delaware Valley Green Building Council. And they are a resource that any municipality can go to within their territory. Already they are helping some municipalities or jurisdictions do some early thinking around what benchmarking could look like for them. So we're going to get started here, and first we're going to hear from Caroline Keicher. So Caroline, take it away.
So thank you all for having me today. I'm excited to get a chance to present to you about energy benchmarking and disclosure in U.S. cities. I'm with the Institute for Market Transformation. If you want to go to the next slide. So just to give you a quick overview of IMT, we are a nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., and we focus on energy efficiency and green building policy. We work a lot with cities and states and counties around the country on policies for catalyzing energy efficiency in existing buildings. And we are sort of a national best practices center for building policy and just sort of trying to bring cities together to discuss these things and then help facilitate best practices and challenges to help pave the way for new cities moving forward with some of these policies. So next slide. So today I want to talk about energy benchmarking and disclosure, which is a policy that's been gaining traction in U.S. cities in the last few years and that we're seeing have a lot of success with this issue of reducing energy in existing buildings, particularly in commercial buildings. So one of the things that we're seeing, a lot of the innovation in the U.S. in terms of energy efficiency and carbon emission reductions are happening at the city level. Certainly there's a lot of stalemate at the national level, and states have some of that political, some of those political challenges as well. But at the city level, we're seeing a lot of innovation and a lot of new ideas and just a lot of really great work being done. And so cities are asking these questions. How do we change our energy profile? How do we reduce our emissions. And when they start to break down a whole city profile, what many cities are seeing is that a vast majority of carbon emissions are coming from existing buildings. Now, that's especially true in large cities that have extensive public transit systems like New York City, where buildings account for 75% of their energy. Nationwide buildings are about, commercial buildings are about 40% of energy, but again, in cities, that's often much higher. Next slide. So up to today, what we're seeing is that even with the most aggressive codes and incentive programs that sort of aim to target efficiency in new construction, that's not been enough. It's only managed to sort of flatten per capita energy usage and not drive it down in the way that would meet many city goals that incorporate, 80% by 2050 kind of long-term carbon emission goals. So something else needs to be done. Next slide. So governments are asking, what drives demand and competition in other industries? How can we make markets work more effectively? How can we cause demand for energy efficiency to be increased? And how can these things all work together to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in existing buildings? So this idea of benchmarking and disclosure, of measuring energy consumption on a yearly basis and disclosing that information to the market, it's not a new idea. We see it on calorie counts for food. We see it on Energy Star appliance guides. We see it on cars with MPG ratings. So this idea of transparency of energy performance is not a new idea. It's just kind of a newer idea for buildings. Next slide. So this is just to give you a quick overview of what current benchmarking policies look like in the U.S. Green states are places where public buildings are required to be benchmarked in some form or another, so the government is leading by example and making sure that their own portfolios are measured. Purple, blue states and cities are areas where there's some kind of residential disclosure required, usually for single-family homes. That's often a time of construction or time of sale and can be anything from disclosing energy bills at the time of sale to actually having someone come in and perform a home energy audit at some point in the home's life. So, that's kind of all over the place, but there's some good movement there. Areas that are yellow, cities and states, are places that we know are interested or working on commercial energy efficiency, benchmarking, and disclosure policies. And then what I want to point you most to are the sort of red-pink color, California, Washington State, and then Seattle, San Francisco, Austin, Texas, Minneapolis, Chicago, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. These are all the places that have actually enacted mandatory benchmarking and disclosure policies for some subset of the large commercial buildings and in some cases the large multifamily buildings. And that's really what I want to focus in on today. And several of these have just happened in the last year, so it's really gaining quite a bit of momentum here in the U.S. Next slide. Now, this slide is a little complicated for PowerPoint, but I just wanted to throw it up there to basically make the point that even though there is a lot of variation among these policies because every city is different and every city's needs are going to be different and every city's building stock is going to have a different sort of shape and form, the framework for these policies is very similar in a lot of ways. So, non-residential buildings are always impacted, sometimes large multifamily. Almost always there's reporting to local government and then some type of disclosure, either a public disclosure on a public website or to existing tenants, or at a time of disclosure, so sale, lease, or financing. There are some additional complementary elements in some of these, and I can talk in more detail if people have questions about any of this, but for now I just kind of wanted to throw it up there to make that point. Next slide. So I just want to also emphasize that even though we're only talking about 9 U.S. cities and 2 states, the impact of these policies, because they cover so many buildings, has just been huge. So we're looking at right now, each year these policies that already exist and are on the books are going to impact more than 51,000 properties. Next slide. which equates to a really huge amount of square footage, 5.8 billion square feet. So that is, I don't have the exact statistic, but basically if you take every big box store in America, all the Costco's and the Targets and the Walmarts, and you multiply it times 3 or 4, you basically get this amount of square footage. So even though it's only a handful of cities, these are really becoming transformative policies even when you look across the national landscape, because these are some of the largest real estate markets in the country. Next page. Also, we're starting to see some early evidence that these policies save energy. I think everyone sort of expected them to and theorized that they did, but until they're actually in play and you can start measuring, it's hard to really confirm, A, the savings, and B, the extent of the savings. EPA did an analysis in 2010 that found that buildings that were benchmarked in Portfolio Manager saved an average of 2.4% of energy per year for a total of 7 over the 4 years that they were tracking, and increased their Energy Star rating. So, for most of these buildings, that's going to be the active measuring and then engaging in some kind of operational or low-cost energy savings measures. So, it's huge to see these early findings that we're seeing evidence that benchmarking can lead to pretty substantial energy savings. Next slide. We're also starting to see studies that are showing premiums on rental price, sale price, and occupancy rates for those buildings that do achieve the Energy Star label, so the label that marks your building is in the top quartile of building performance as compared to other similar buildings across the country. So, that's a really good indication of the value of energy efficiency being accepted and forwarded by the market. Next slide. So I won't talk about this in too much detail because I know we have a presenter from Philadelphia on the webinar as well, but Philadelphia passed one of these ordinances in 2012, June. This involves all buildings, all non-residential buildings over 50,000 square feet, and requires annual benchmarking and annual public disclosure. The city will be making those ratings available after the second year of reporting. So buildings get, and it's very typical of these policies, that building owners get a year grace period between first benchmark and second benchmark before they're released publicly, so everyone has time to sort of figure out the tool, learn how to use it, and make some improvements before the scores are released publicly. But this is a great example for Pennsylvania as a city sort of leading the way. Next slide. I also want to talk about New York City's plan. So New York City is very unique because it's New York City, but they have a really fantastic progressive plan that we like to at least point to as where you can think about going when you're thinking about these packages of policies. So New York City set a target, a greenhouse gas target, 30% reduction by 2030, and their plan, in addition to including a mandatory benchmarking and disclosure ordinance for every single building over 50,000 square feet, and that included their multifamily buildings. They also included some additional elements. They have a requirement for mandatory energy audits and mandatory retro-commissioning or building tune-up every 10 years. And lighting upgrades are required. All lighting has to be brought up to code as tenants turn over and tenant spaces turn over. They have to bring the lighting in those spaces up to code. And tenants over a certain square foot threshold have to be sub-metered so that there can be more feedback between building owners and tenants in a building in terms of individual energy use. So one of the things also in New York that was very interesting, so New York has millions of buildings, or at least over 1 million buildings. But when they went to design their policy, they basically looked at what size threshold could they set for buildings that would impact the smallest number of buildings. So they really wanted to get at the large buildings and not really involve the smaller ones right out the gate, but have the largest impact in terms of square footage. So they figured out that if they set their threshold at 50,000 square feet, that they would be capturing about 50% of the floor area of the city, but only 2% of the building stock. So instead of having to deal with over 1 million buildings, they were suddenly only dealing with 16,000 buildings, which is still quite a significant number, but was a much more manageable number for the city to work with than the full sort of million-plus building. One of the things that really inspired this policy, when New York City looked at their buildings profile and looked at sort of what they were dealing with, they realized that 85% of the buildings that currently exist in New York City were still going to be there in 2030. So they had to find a way to really get at the savings available in existing buildings, not just new buildings, if they wanted to get to their carbon reduction goals. Next slide. So there's some really interesting findings coming out of New York City's data, and I think we're going to see very similar findings, or not similar, but other interesting findings from other cities as they start gathering their data and they start being able to run analyses. I think the most interesting thing about these policies is that suddenly cities have this wealth of information about how their building stocks are performing and what their building stocks even look like that they never have had before, ever. I mean, cities often don't even have a full inventory of what buildings exist in their borders, and so this is leading to them asking questions that they never even knew to ask to begin with. So one of the really interesting, and there's a lot more in the report, so if you're interested, you should take a look, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of interesting findings. One, in New York City, they found that energy intensity was actually higher in the newer buildings than the older buildings. I think there was a lot of fear that older buildings would be stigmatized, that they wouldn't perform as well, that they wouldn't score as well. And in New York City, it's actually the opposite. The older buildings are doing better and scoring higher than the newer buildings. And there are a number of reasons that it could account for that, but it's a pretty interesting finding. They're still kind of trying to tease out the exact cause of that. Next slide. The other really interesting thing they found was that when they looked at the worst performers and the best performers among different building segments, they found that the difference of energy use was not 20% more, 30% more, 50% more. It was 400 to 800 times as much. Or not 400 times, but 400% of. So 4 to 8 times it was being used in these buildings. The spread was just immense, and so you can really see the opportunity to save energy just by going after the very worst performers is huge. And it lets a city better target its incentive programs, its rebate programs, its education programs to really target those buildings that need the most help to get them up to comparable to what their peers are using in terms of energy. They looked at sort of a cross-section of this and basically found that if they could bring all the lowest performers up to just the average 50% mark in terms of energy performance, they could save 18% of energy citywide, not just in buildings, but citywide. And if they could get everybody up to the 75-point mark, so if everybody could get Energy Star certified, they could save 31% of energy across the entire city. So you can really see the opportunity here, and it really helps them pinpoint where they want to put their focus. Next slide. So I just want to highlight this really quickly. Chicago is the most recent city. They passed a bill just earlier, last month, I believe, and they have a very similar policy to a lot of what we've seen, looking at commercial buildings and multifamily buildings above 50,000 square feet. Got a phased-in timeline, so start with the largest and give the slightly smaller buildings a little more time to learn the tool and comply. And the really interesting thing about Chicago's ordinance, and sort of the new element that we haven't seen in a city before, is this idea of data verification. So, Portfolio Manager is a tool where the building owner can use it, the building manager can use it, or someone can be hired to put the data in. But because of that, I mean, cities have been running very good training programs, but because of that, you do get errors in the data, and it's hard to really know for sure if the data you're getting is completely accurate. For the most part it is, but cities have certainly had to go back and do some targeted sort of outreach to help where they've found errors. In Chicago, they're actually requiring data verification. So every first year and every third year, an architect or an engineer licensed is going to have to sign off on the data and basically say, yes, this looks good, and we're verifying that from the building owner end, this data looks good. And that's going to really help the city in terms of the amount of time they have to spend cleaning the data, fixing the data, and sort of sorting through it. It also sort of, you have to get that verification if you want the Energy Star certification score, 75 or above. So I think it'll also help building owners sort of strive for that certification, which should be really good. Next slide. So I want to talk just for a couple of minutes about opportunities and considerations for small and medium cities. Most of the cities that have done this to date are on the larger side. Some sort of fall in the arbitrary medium bucket. But there are a lot of things to think about for small and medium cities that are considering this and how to scale it to make it work. So there are a number of small and medium cities that are currently working on these policies. Santa Monica, California, Orange County, Florida, Burlington, Vermont, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Boulder, Colorado, and Berkeley, California, just to name a few. And so soon I think we'll have a good model, or at least a beginning model for how this can be done and a good example. But there's a couple things to think about already. So one, leading by example. I think we all recognize that mandates and requirements and laws are not always attainable right now, or they're not the starting point for a lot of places. So a really good place to start for any city, small or large, is leading by example. So starting with your own building, benchmarking internally as a government, and then making those benchmarks public and really holding government buildings to a higher standard of transparency and accountability in terms of taxpayer dollars, because taxpayer dollars are what fund what pay for energy bills in government buildings. And so starting there and really showing a really good example of what the private sector should be doing is a great place to start. The second piece is data access. So all buildings need access to whole building energy consumption data for the previous 12 months in order to be able to benchmark using the Portfolio Manager tool. In a lot of these cities, the utilities are getting on board and developing systems to help provide this data to building owners. They're aggregating the data to protect tenant privacy, but then providing one number to building owners that helps prevent errors in data collection, and it also just makes the process a lot easier for building owners. So if starting the conversation with the utilities now is something that's possible to get utility buy-in and to get them to start thinking about how they can provide this data, that's a huge benefit and a huge sort of first step in making benchmarking easier for everybody involved, whether or not you have a policy on the book. Another great way to engage sectors is through challenge programs. So, recruiting and rewarding sectors of the built environment to benchmark voluntarily and make a commitment to try to reduce their energy consumption by some percentage, and then to be rewarded and recognized by the city or the town or the mayor can be very motivational and can help build leaders in that city that then, later down the road, if a requirement or a law is a consideration, can really be champions of those efforts because they've seen firsthand why everyone should be benchmarking and, how valuable that can be. Partnerships are also really important. We saw in places like New York City, even a large city with a large sustainability department, they utilized folks in their financial department, in their building department. They worked very closely with Urban Green, the local chapter of USGBC. Urban Green ran trainings for building owners, gave presentations on how to use the tool and on the law. They worked closely with the City University of New York. They actually supplied interns to help run their help center. So in all of these cities, partnerships are so important with local nonprofits, with universities, with other government departments to really make these policies work and to help get the most bang for the buck and to make them manageable for the folks who are implementing them. So there are a lot of possibilities there to spread this work out and to make it more palatable. size thresholds are an important consideration. So, in New York City, we're talking 16,000 buildings, but in somewhere like Santa Monica, they're looking at a size threshold of 25,000 square feet or larger, and that actually is only going to be about 200 to 250 buildings. So they can have one of these policies and only really having to do outreach to about 200 building owners. That makes it very manageable. I mean, you could, in theory, get on the phone and talk to 200 people in a week or two. So that's going to be, even if they only have 1 or 2 staff people sort of working on this part-time, that's going to be a manageable policy. In Orange County, Florida, they're looking at 40,000 square feet and larger, which is over half of their square footage total, and it's going to be less than 500 buildings. So a little bit bigger again, but a very manageable number of buildings to involve. This just plays into program manageability. So, when designing policies, it's important to look at what the implementation steps are going to be and how manageable that's going to be for city staff. And you can look at things like partnerships and size thresholds and work with utilities and other local players to make this an easier process and to share some of the burden of implementation. And then another really important factor we're seeing is regional collaboration. So if more than one local city are moving together, you can share resources, you can share training, you can go together to talk to the utility, publicity is easier, all kinds of good stuff. So, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Boston went first, and now Cambridge is looking to go as well, and they're going to be sharing resources as they move forward in terms of, very likely a help center and publicity, perhaps even staff that can help with both. Orange County, Florida is moving parallel to Orlando, Florida, so they're going to be able to share a lot of resources. Santa Monica is looking at potentially moving parallel with Los Angeles. So again, a lot of opportunities there to really share. And I think in Pennsylvania in particular, with all of the cities and townships, that could work very well regionally if cities decided to move together. Next slide. So I'm almost out of time, but I just want to quickly talk about a couple of initiatives that are happening that are happening nationally that are supporting these types of policies. The Data Access and Transparency Alliance, we talked about data access from utilities. This is something that a lot of folks are interested in, finding ways to get better access to energy data for whole buildings, apart from mandates, just because the data is so valuable on its own. We started this alliance, and it includes BOMA, the Building Operations Managers Association, Real Estate Roundtable, NRDC, USGBC, and Enterprise, really working to try to come up with national strategies to help promote better access to data and to help sort of spur this on. Next slide. There's also been a lot of federal momentum around these policies. The administration started the Better Buildings Initiative, and if folks are looking for sort of a good first step, joining the Better Buildings Challenge is a really great first step in doing this work. The administration is looking at this and seeing the value in working with existing buildings, and there's a lot of good chance for work and collaboration and recognition through the Better Buildings Challenge. Another thing that we're seeing that's really fantastic, DOE, the Department of Energy, is working on a standard energy efficiency data platform, SEED, which basically connects straight to Portfolio Manager, and it's a free database that cities will be able to download and host on their own internal websites that connects directly to Portfolio Manager, so that when building owners are submitting their data, there's already a database at the city level to house and organize all that data, and cities don't have to make the investment on the IT side to do that themselves. So those are some good federal initiatives. And next slide. And that's all that I really have today. So I'll be available for questions, and please feel free to email me